Velkommen alle sammen. This is the second part to the Viking Age sports series. In the video last week, I went over all the sources that we have from the sagas and other primary sources detailing sports in the Viking Age. I recommend you watch that one first, because that one is on the sources and, which sports in the Viking Age were popular, how athletes were viewed in society, the importance of physical prowess and athleticism in the Viking Age, and how that reflected on people's honor and reputation, that kind of thing. So those we actually have sources of coming from the Viking Age about what it was like. What we don't have sources on is information on things like training, what the actual athletic events were like, and most important for the purpose of this channel, the spirituality of sports and the connection to the gods and the divine. Fortunately, the Greek sources do go over all this information, so we can use the Greek sources to fill in the blanks that we have in the Norse ones, because guys, like I say all the time, these cultures really weren't that different in their kind of societal norms, and especially the religious beliefs, as I have made many videos about now. That's why I'm doing a series on this. And like I said in my other videos, I'm not an expert on Greek religion or history, and I'm not Greek, and I want to remain respectful to other cultures that are not mine, so when I speak about the Greek stuff, I do not go into depth into the history, and I keep my mouth shut with my opinions to myself. All I do when I speak about cultures that are not mine is show you the primary sources and the archaeological finds. So that's what I'm doing in this video, and I'm going to give a quick analysis on whether the same aspects of that Greek culture would have been present in Scandinavia during the Viking Age. And I'm also going to be showing you some of these epic locations in Greece that I have been to quite a few times. First thing I noticed, a lot of these incredibly old and sacred areas dedicated to the gods and the divine, all the famous temples and the sacred sites all over Greece. What do many of them have right next to them? Stadiums and gymnasiums that were used for events and training alike. Here on the island of Rhodos, where I used to live a few years back, I would come and work out here a couple times a week. Very powerful and spiritual in this stadium here. The temple to Apollo and the sacred grove and all the other characteristics of an acropolis, they are all at this location here. But just down the hill is a beautiful stadium dating to almost 2,500 years ago. Here's another in Athens. It's the Panhellenic stadium, with parts of it that are dated to more than 600 BC, and later it was built upon to host the Panhellenic Games, which were held every 4 years in honor of the goddess Athena. It's also just a short walk away from the oldest temple of Zeus, by the way, here. Speaking of Zeus, here is the main Olympic stadium, Olympia, Greece. This area is dated back to the 8th century BC, and this was the main place for the Olympic Games for most of their history. This place is also located right next to an ancient temple of Zeus. I don't have any video from here. These photos are just from online. Finally, though, my favorite place that I have been to in Greece is Delphi, which is regarded as the navel and center of the world in ancient Greece, with multiple temples, and it is the most sacred place in the world it was viewed at the time. Here too, there is a magnificent stadium at the top of the hill, and also slightly below is a gymnasium where young men could not just train. They had a big gym, but they also had changing rooms and bathhouses. This may actually be the world's oldest proper gym. So not every temple and stadium were right next to each other as the examples that I showed here, but generally the most important sacred places had some section of it for athletics. So the question is, was this concept maybe present in the Viking Age as well? We don't have any clear records that it was. There are definitely not any stadiums or archaeological finds from the time in Scandinavia. However, I believe sports were a part of these major high festivals in the Viking Age as well, and these sacred places. And the reason we think that is because we know sports were typically played at the gatherings, and they would, most of them would be called the All Things, or the Sacred High Festivals, or the Bluts of the year. And these annual meetings by the Norse basically always took place at some sacred area. For example, in Grettir's saga, there were athletic events that took place at the spring assembly at a place called Hegranesting, and any place with the name Thing in it, that would have been a place where the meetings would have taken place, and also the high festivals and other religious ceremonies, and most of the places with the Thing in the name, that was considered as sacred. Another source, Eyrbyggja saga, the people of Breidavik held a game festival around the Vetternatter, so the winter nights, which was the most sacred kind of ceremony of the year. It was the start of the winter and the new year, and people stayed here for 2 weeks or more, living in what is called leikskalar, so game sheds or game halls. Vetternatter, we know there it was only 3 days of party and the most holy celebrations. But in this source, Eyrbyggja saga, it seems as though the athletes lived there for a couple weeks in preparation for the event. So it does seem like there was some athletic games there, even though the events aren't tested in the sources in that good detail. Let's move on to some quotes from ancient Greece. There are a few different tales in the mythology about how the Olympics were first born and founded. So there's a few myths about that. I won't go into them all, but the oldest and kind of most recognized explanation comes in Pausanias' work, and this is the main source actually that has the most about the Olympics. So I'll be referring to Pausanias' works quite a lot in the quotes in this video. But under his account, the mythological figure Heracles and 4 of his brothers had a race at Olympia to entertain Zeus, who was just a newborn at that time. So this shows how incredibly old this concept of the athletic games could have been, and it also shows the theme here that we will constantly come back to, that the athletic events were there as entertainment for the gods and to honor the gods. Greek gods loved sporting events, apparently, according to the sources. So it could be, these athletic games, it could be that old, dating back to whenever Zeus was born, however many thousands and thousands of years that goes back in the chronology. But officially, the first Olympic Games took place in the year 776 BC, as we can date this source to. And at that time, the first Olympics, it included just a foot race. After that, in following years, additional distances were added. Then later on came the pentathlons, and then came wrestling and boxing, and these are really the earliest sports, and not much more were added to the Olympic Games for many hundreds of years. And here's a little chart to show when other sports were brought in to these games. But always from the start of the Olympics all the way until today, really, the most prestigious event is really the race. Specifically in ancient Greece, the distance of the stadium, which was about 200 meters, because this was the oldest event, and the winner of that race, he was called the Olympiakon. I don't know how to pronounce it. Olympionikes. So he was basically declared as the winner of the whole Olympics, showing that running this race, the 200 meter, about the distance of the Olympic Stadium, that was the main and most prestigious event. Wrestling was also quite important. The most dangerous was pancration, which was a very brutal form of wrestling, as you can see in this quote, and it very much resembles our modern MMA. So it really was mainly running, and then later on in the Olympic history, some sort of combat, like the wrestling, the boxing, the pancration, and then the horse racing stuff was added to it later on in history. Also notable was the pentathlon, which included 5 sports: running, jumping, the long jump, the discus throw, the javelin throw, and wrestling was in that as well. Of course, there were lots more sports in ancient Greece. There were more informal ones, things resembling like ball games, like handball, and even they did like rowing and stone lifting, all these kinds of different sports, but they didn't do it in the Olympics. That's why I'm not covering those kind of less unorganized sports, because anyone in history can make up a game and play it. Two monkeys can get together and see who throws a branch furthest. So what I'm doing in this video is focusing on the organized sports. I'm not going to speak about all the potential games that humans would have played. So again, coming back to the question, what would it have been like in Scandinavia in the Viking Age or even earlier? Would these main Greek sports that I just spoke about, would they be played in Scandinavia? The written sources definitely mentioned wrestling the most, so of course they did wrestling, or glima as it was called at the time. That is by far the most common in the Viking sagas. We also have spear throwing, but the Viking spear, that sport was more thrown for like accuracy than distance, like was done in the javelin throw in ancient Greece. Also, in the Viking sagas, horseback riding is attested quite a bit, and that's about it, guys. And of course, they would have done some more of the sports that the ancient Greeks did. We just don't have any records of it. The Norse were more into other sports that, of course, the Greeks didn't do, like skiing, swimming, a game called not like good, and other sports that I covered in my previous video last week, so you can check that out. But again, we have very little evidence of organized grand spectacles of sports in the Viking Age. There were organized sports and events, but nowhere near the scale of the Greek Olympics and the other games. Let's talk about the truces, because that is a very important part of the Olympics, both in ancient times and even today. Basically a halt on the war that the Olympics brought. It was called the Epictetus. I don't know how to pronounce these things, I'm horrible, but it's up here on the screen. So a peace treaty of Nicias between Athens and Sparta, which was dating to around 420 BC. And one of the first terms of that peace treaty is that the warring nations would honor the peace anytime they were traveling to compete in any of the main athletic events of the age, like the Olympics and so on. We do see this kind of in Norse sources a little bit. It didn't have anything to do with sports, but at certain high festivals, for example, like Yule, no violence was permitted. Even among warring chieftains, if they came across each other, there was under no circumstances to be any violence. So let's talk about the Greek high festivals, because this is what the Olympics were centered around. It wasn't just people gathering for the Olympics, it was a high festival, a sacred religious festival, and the Olympics took place there as just one of the festivities that were going on there. Generally, the Olympics, the Olympiad, they were held every 4 years, but there were other smaller regional games that were also very important and sacred. These four high festivals of different times of the year were dedicated to a god each. There was the Olympic Games, that's the main one, of course, like I mentioned, that those were always in honor of Zeus and held at Olympia. There were the Pythian Games of Delphi, and they were in honor of the god Apollo. There were the Isthmian Games by the sea in honor of Poseidon, and then there was a final game, the Nemean Games, so those were also in honor of Zeus. Okay, so definitely we see some even more similarities here to the Viking Age. In the Viking Age, we also had three, arguably four, major sacred festivals that we can link to the gods. The Sigurblot would be the one at the start of the summer, which would be a sacrifice to Odin. There would be Yule in the midwinter, which would be a sacrifice to Freyr or Thor, and it's probably more commonly Freyr. Then we have Vetternatter at the start of the winter, or their new year, which we just passed, by the way. It was a couple weeks ago. And that would be most commonly a sacrifice to the elves. It would be the Alpha Blut, or the honorable ancestral spirits. Maybe a god, depending on the situation at the time. And finally, we have the fourth sacrifice that is often referred to as Disablut, which took place every 9 years at Uppsala around March time, and we would have had a sacrifice to the Disir, or the female goddesses. So that's just a little parallel there, though, although again, in the Norse sources, the sports aren't mentioned at any of these high festivals like the Greek ones are. But the Greek ones, sporting events were definitely a main attraction at these four high festivals. But in the Norse world, I'm sure there were sports played there, but they just weren't one of the main attractions for that. Next, we'll speak about who can compete, because this is very interesting. Only free-born Greek men were allowed to compete, and in later on Olympics, they allowed young boys to compete as well, and they could also win the Olympic gold. They had men's and boys division. Women were not allowed to compete. Women were not even allowed to watch the events, as you see in this quote here, where you would be legally obligated to hurl a woman down off the stands if she snuck in to watch the sports. However, just after that, in this same source, it mentions that on some occasions, some women would be allowed to watch. Whoever the priestess of Demeter was at the time, she would be allowed to watch from a marble altar. Also, on certain occasions, virgins were permitted to come in and watch the athletic events as well. On very rare occasions, though, there were contests where women were allowed to compete. A princess of Sparta, for example, named Siniska, she raised horses, and she was allowed to compete in the chariot race, and she actually won. And she was the only woman to win at the time. That would have been around the mid-400s BC. Also, there was a special event set up for women every 4 years. Those were called the Heraea Games, and that was basically just a race for virgin females. All the girls, all the way from young girls to elderly women who had maybe not had a taste of the D yet for whatever reason, but only virgins were allowed to compete for whatever reason. They were divided up by age, and they would all get to run the standard length of the stadium, again, like I said, about 200 meters, and the winner would get a crown of olive branches, just like the men would who won the Olympics. And they also got a good part of the cow that was sacrificed to Hera. So at this event, so this was also a sacred festival, and the women would get to compete in the sports at this event. So this sounds a heck of a lot like the May Queen Games, okay, which is a Germanic tradition I've done videos on. Many of you know about this, a race or even a dancing event where the winner of that would be crowned as the May Queen. We have sources for this thing all over the Germanic world, all over the north of Europe, so we know this type of thing was done then. Other than that, we don't really have any other sources mentioning women competing in sports in the Viking Age, so it seems very much in Scandinavia at the time to be a men's thing there also. Although it does seem in the Viking Age, it does seem like women were not prohibited from attending the athletic events to view them as they were in ancient Greece, for example. One thing that I find very cool is this idea of purity before entering the athletic games. There would be a sacrifice before the athletic games, usually of a pig, and the people would have to be purified in a sacred spring, according to, again, this is Pausanias, Pausanias' works. This is also something that took place in the Norse world. Again, plenty of records of having sacrifices in the Norse world, and even some examples that you could purify yourself with the blood of the sacrificial animal. They would take a twig and a bowl filled with the sacrificial blood and splatter that blood everywhere, all over the people, the temple, everything. So also most temples and sacred places, like in ancient Greece, they were located right near a spring which one could purify themselves in. These temples are all over Scandinavia, these ancient sacred springs. But again, no mention that this was done before sports in the Norse world, but they very well could have done it. Also, the Greeks would typically make an oath to a god right here. You see in this quote, and also it writes that the judges of the events must also swear this same oath that they had not been bribed before they do the judging, or they have not done any shenanigans like that. Again, we see this all over the Norse sources, swearing oaths. Quite commonly, it would be an oath on an arm ring, but we have one example from Håkon the Good's saga where actually a boar is brought in and they all swear oaths upon it. They put their hand on the boar and swear oaths on the boar before the sacrifice, just like they did in the ancient Greece. Again, no sports are mentioned in the Norse sources about that, but the oath swearing part is almost the exact same thing as 2,000 years apart. Only difference is that the Greeks would not eat the meat of an animal that they swore an oath upon, according to Homer, which is the earliest, most reliable source. In the Viking world, completely the opposite. They would swear an oath upon the boar or whatever animal, and they would cook the meat and eat it. And in the Håkon saga, they actually boiled it. Getting to the last of the video, we're going to speak about reputation. This is very important because I touched on that a lot in the Viking Age in the video I did last week. Sometimes people in ancient Greece who did very well in the Olympics were regarded as divine after they died. Here is one quote saying how an Olympic victor would be worshipped by mortals on his statue after death. So he is idolized as a god for winning 3 Olympic Games, this man. Another example, also this is in Pausanias' works, a man named Theagenes who won many Olympic Games. He had a statue made out of him after him when he died. The statue fell down upon one of his rivals when his rivals was whipping the statue, and the people of the village threw the statue into the sea. A horrible drought and famine came, to which the oracle of Delphi, the village, consulted her, and she said that the village needed to worship Theagenes as a god in order to have good harvest in the future. We also have things like King Leonidas, who famously had a grand burial and statue made of him after his death, and the Spartans held funeral games in his honor after that point in history. So even after death, there was this sort of idolizing of successful athletes or legendary figures in general. These are just a couple quick examples that I mentioned here, but there were many, many Olympic victors who were idolized. This doesn't happen in the Norse world so much. We don't see anyone idolized after death because of their sporting accomplishments, but we see idolizing real human beings after death. Treating them as gods, and if they did something very special to improve the fertility or the agriculture of the area, or ones who were very successful in battle, it was the same exact thing. In life, however, in the Viking Age, your athletic ability was also too there, just like in Greece, very much tied to your honor and your status. And success in sports could earn you a higher placement, like in a seat in the king's hall, as I spoke about in my other video. Finally, we'll finish the video by speaking about training. I see a whole load of shit out there about ancient Greek training. The truth is, we don't have a lot of sources that go into this. Most people are just making things up or just coming to wild conclusions from what little evidence we have. But here are a couple quotes to give you an idea, some reliable sources. Here is one post-training ritual of getting naked and rubbing yourself down in oil, as the Spartans did. But being naked in competition, I know a lot of people make fun of the Greeks for that and the early Olympics. This was not a normal thing. It wasn't until the 15th Olympics in about 720 BC that one man ran naked. But before then, they were all ashamed to show their little stinky winkies flapping in the wind during this race. Here's one more great quote about training and the difficulties that you would arise from it. Basically, a philosopher encouraging someone, to, think hard about whether they wanted to be an Olympian or not. Okay, so these are just a few quotes that tell us about the physical training and how it would have been and how it would be structured. But like I said, there's a lot more kind of little bits and pieces out there in the sources about how the ancient Greeks trained. I'm gonna have to do a completely separate video on that. If you guys want to see, let me know, because there's really a lot of very gray areas that need long, in-depth explanations and analysis of the archaeological finds and ancient Greek terms. There's just, like I mentioned, there's not a ton of clear, reliable sources that tell us to do what the Greeks actually did for their training. Like, what did they do for how long, how many sets, reps, stuff like that. Did the Vikings, again, coming back, did the Vikings train for their sports? Yes, of course they did, but I'm only aware of one single source mentioning training in the Viking Age. In general, and success and victory in sports in the Viking Age was viewed as something that was a natural-born gift. Whatever hero or king or chieftain of the Viking Age was mentioned, they were already very good at that particular sport from a very young age. But of course they trained, of course they did train, we just don't have any sources about what they did. I'll finish off my video with two of my favorite quotes about sports from ancient Greece. One is about the rewards and trophies. After the Battle of Thermopylae, a Persian learned from a deserter that the Greeks were watching the Olympic Games, and that's why most of the Greeks weren't there to fight in the Battle of Thermopylae. And one Persian asked a Greek runaway, "What is the prize for which they are competing in the Olympics?" And they replied that the gift was a crown of olive leaves. When the Persian learned that the prize was a crown and not money, he could not keep silent but said before everyone, "Oh dear, what kind of men have you brought us to fight against? Men who compete for not material things but for excellence." So like the Persians, they were terrified because they could not comprehend competing in something like this, like the Greek sports, and they got no cash prize if they won. It was just purely for reputation and honor. Of course, this was the view in the Viking Age too. We don't have any records of any cash prizes or any rewards at all from sports. It was only competing for a good and honorable reputation. Last one, you have probably all heard. Many of the Greek philosophers would take on would only take on students who were successful in sports. Most famously, Plato. He who is only an athlete is too crude, too much of a savage. He who is only a scholar is too soft, too effeminate. The ideal citizen is the scholar athlete, the man of thought and the man of action. And I think that's a fantastic idea, and we should all live by these words. It's not okay to just be a dumbass athlete with no brains, and it's not okay to be a very smart, intelligent puss boy either. It is part of being a man to be good at both, have both brains and brawn, and all the other things that come with that. And this was very much prevalent in the Viking Age too. It's not like today where most intelligent people are from the high class and they suck at sports, and it's not like today where most athletes are from the low class and barely have any brain function at all. I said most, okay, I didn't say all. I'm not attacking everyone because there are a lot of smart athletes today too. I'm just saying most of them are dumbasses, but not all of them. In the Viking Age, it was completely the same thing as in ancient Greek. The best athletes were often the high-class nobles that were also had brains too. They were chieftains, they were kings, they were nobles, they were high-ranking people, whatever, and they demonstrated their athletic ability and their intelligence and their ability to adapt and lead and inspire others. And they demonstrated this wisdom and the athletic ability together, like I said, just like in ancient Greece as well. And I think that's a great philosophy that we can all live by today. But that's all I have to say for this video. I hope you enjoyed. That was a long one. I might do one more on ancient Greek training. If you guys want to see it, let me know down below in the comments. But that's all for today. Vi ses nästa gång.